Are you ready for a fascinating look into the world of economics? In today's episode of the Liberty Brief podcast, Dr. Tom Giordano and I are going to explore the importance of truthful information in the marketplace. Truthful information. We're taking a closer look at why the economy experiences downturns and what could be causing them. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Liberty Brief podcast, episode 20. I'm your host, Robert Melso. Today, we're going to discuss a powerful lesson that Dr. Tom Giordano learned from his father in the winter of 1974. I think that would make you about 90 years old, Tom. Okay. Well, we'll be delving into the insights found in Chapter 18 of his book, Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters. Now, before you roll your eyes at the prospect of another lesson in economics, take a few minutes and think about how important economics is to your life and the lives of those around you. Then listen along and get ready to expand your understanding and challenge your perspectives on why things go bust. America's founders are calling. It's your opportunity to respond. This is the Liberty Brief podcast with your host, Robert Melso, featuring Dr. Thomas Giordano. Okay, we're going to continue on the subject of economics that we started in the last episode. As you may recall, one of the roles of government intervention in the marketplace that Adam Smith thought was important for the general welfare was the dissemination of truthful information. Well, this episode is going to touch upon that very premise and show you how central banks lie to us all. The topic of today's discussion is why we have downturns in the economy every so often and what the causes are. It turns out they're a result of a few ways banks, especially central banks, communicate information to the marketplace. Now, this might at first seem like a complicated subject, but it really isn't. It does require a short study of history and linking to some seemingly unconnected effects to actions which are misinterpreted by the market. So let me bring in Dr. Tom and we can get on our way. We have quite a bit to discuss. Hi, Dr. Tom.
Yo, Rob. I'm glad to see you're back from your short trip out west again.
Yo, that's a Philly word.
Yeah, well, that's where I'm from.
Yes, my wife and I did a little bit of traveling, and we even stopped off in Washington, D.C., took in the sights. It was pretty inspiring.
Yeah, I'm sure.
All right, Dr. Tom. Firstly, I was pretty impressed with the description your father gave you in Chapter 18 of your book, dealing with booms and busts. It took a pretty long while for economists to figure out why they occurred. Let's start by asking you to give a simple definition on just what the business cycle is.
Okay. Well, simply put, the business cycle refers to the recurring pattern of economic expansion and contraction that an economy experiences over time. Okay. It's characterized by periods of growth, which they call a boom, where the economy is strong and thriving, and it's followed by periods of decline, which they call a bust, where the economy slows down and may even enter a recession. The duration and intensity of each phase can vary, but the overall cycle tends to repeat itself over several years.
You know, there's that word, recession. You know, I have to mention, true to form, it turns out, that the Brain Trust at the White House has redefined that word, or perhaps they don't seem to know its meaning. You know, let's see if we can help them out. A recession is defined as two, count them two, fiscal quarters of negative growth. Got it? In any case, one of the consequences of these hiccups in the economy was the bank runs, or panics as they were called in the past. Panics that the cabal between the bankers and some high-placed politicians deceitfully used to justify the creation of the Federal Reserve System that we went over in episode 15.
Well, Rob, it was a real economic mystery until relatively recently. Economists had tried to crack the code of these ups and downs, but they just didn't seem to envision the whole picture. Now, my dad told me about all of the theories, each adding a piece to the puzzle, except for Marx. He was like a kid playing checkers while everybody else was playing chess. He just couldn't keep his tower of economic theory standing. It turns out his views were not founded in reality, like most of what he was positing. He was almost totally wrong.
Well, I wouldn't call it checkers. Maybe go fish would be a better,
Go fish. Yeah.
better description. Now, you didn't mention Marx in chapter 18. Why was that?
Well, because my father's lesson to me centered around Friedrich von Hayek's winning the Nobel Prize for his description and explanation of the phenomenon. Besides, Marx had nothing significant to add beyond trying to fit the phenomenon to validate his brainchild, communism. So his profound response was that boom and bust cycles were an inherent feature of capitalism caused by the contradictions and imbalances inherent in the system.
You mean Marx's?
Marx. Though I did include Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard, I also left Adam Smith and David Ricardo out for brevity, and they were very important in formulating this view of the business cycle.
Well, maybe we can touch on those a bit later. Okay, I read his book, The Road to Serfdom. That was Hayek's book.
Mm-hmm.
But for our audience, who was Friedrich von Hayek? What did he propose as the underlying cause for these booms and busts?
Well, Friedrich von Hayek was an Austrian economist and philosopher best known for his defense of classical liberalism and the free market. Now, when we say liberalism in this sense, we're talking about Jeffersonian liberalism, not what's been usurped today. He was a major figure in the Austrian School of Economics and was one of the most prominent economists of the 20th century. As you said, in 1944, he published a scathing criticism of centralized government planning called The Road to Serfdom, as you mentioned. In it, he argues that central planning leads to inefficiency. And on the flip side, that the free market process, through the use of prices, is the best way to coordinate economic activity. Right? He also showed that Nazism and fascism had shared Marx's origins in central economic planning and the consolidation of the state over the individual. I have to laugh when I hear people call fascism and Nazism as right wing. They're not right at all. They're just a little bit. They're a little bit right of left. They're a little bit right of communism, which is as far left as you can get. They are both leftist philosophies. Anyway, so aside from his interpretations of economic principles, Hayek also wrote widely on political philosophy and the concept of freedom. According to my father, it was Hayek who really simplified the idea of economics as being a vehicle of communications over time, using interest rates, prices, the money supply, and credit as the information stream. And herein lies our premise that untruthful or misleading information leads to downturns in the market economy.
You know, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the brilliance of men like him, and perhaps their most brilliant attribute was their ability to simplify complicated things.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
So
it's always in the interest. It's always in the interest of those trying to fool you, to complicate things, and to dazzle you with what we say in Philly. If I can't convince you with logic, I'll dazzle you with bullshit, and that's exactly what these people do.
Well, fortunately for me, that's only transitory.
Oh yeah,
I can
transitory.
Only be fooled so
right.
long.
Transitory. It was that was a new word that they the people in the present administration learned. Oh, it's transitory.
I didn't know that was a word, by the way. I always thought it was transitioning, but I guess it is a word.
No, transitory is a word.
All right.
Transitoria in Italian.
I like it more and more now that everybody's using it.
Oh, yeah. Well, sure, because there's a big difference between transitory and transcendental,
I like it about as much as I like when someone says to me, it is what it is. It's as if I've never heard that saying before.
Yeah, well, hey, it is what it is.
So you're saying that each of these things, interest rates, prices, the money supply, and credit, each of those four things can be manipulated by some higher authority, and the truth or information becomes muddled.
That's precisely correct. That's right. When these things are played with, their normal effects on judicious decision making in industry and by everyday people, are lost. Bad decisions, improper spending, misallocation of resources, and erroneous planning result. The initial periods of boom cannot be sustained, and the bust follows. Do you remember my father's definition of economics?
Yes, well, that wasn't transitory. It's burned in my brain. He called it the judicious use of wealth and resources.
Right. Well, your economy can fail by either making foolish decisions in the face of good information or going outside of your mission, or by making seemingly good decisions based upon false information. They're both roads to the same destination, and that's collapse.
You know, Dr. Tom, if you listen to the left, it seems to me that they always blame these crises or shortages on the, quote, greed of wealthy corporations, end quote. Remember big oil, big banks last year? They were responsible for all of our trouble. Well, here's my example. My wife likes See's candy. It's made out west. They have a raspberry cream chocolate that we couldn't find because of a raspberry shortage 6 months ago. I suppose that was because of Big Raspberry.
Big Raspberry. Yes, but I'm sure that was only transitory, don't you know? Well, it's transitory. We'll get raspberries eventually, Anyway, I brought up this very idea to my father back then, and he just laughed. His response was that he never heard of a human trait such as greed occurring in cycles of about every 15 to 20 years. What they are calling greed, we went over in a different, in a previous podcast, is merely people pursuing their own personal interests. Now, why then isn't there just one continual bust with no booms if greed is the cause? Greed is part of human nature. It's seeking what you desire, or putting an excessive importance on something that you desire.
Right. Well, let's get into the mechanics of just how all of this comes about. Where should we start?
Well, first we have to start with that higher authority as the source of bad signaling to the market, the banks, in particular a central bank or a combination of banks working in tandem. Knowing how they work becomes the basis of our analysis.
Well, first, from what I know of banking, their balance sheets seem contradictory to the average person.
It would seem so. I think we should start here to begin to understand the business cycle, because it really does begin with what banks do with the money and credit they control. What can you tell me about what banks consider assets and liabilities? To make it simple, let's define an asset as anything that you own or will put money into your pockets, and a liability as anything that will take money from your pockets. This is the simplest way to look at assets and liabilities.
All right. Well, all of my previous girlfriends, all one of them was a liability.
You mean everyone? Anyway. Every one of them.
Okay.
All one of them.
Let's keep this part out.
All right. Well, we won't talk about your...
Edit that out.
All one of them. Okay.
Well, in the case of banks, assets would include things like cash on hand and deposits with other banks. You could include securities such as bonds and stocks, loans, mortgages, consumer loans, business loans. The list goes on and on.
Mm-hmm.
Properties, investments in subsidiaries. You get the idea.
Yeah.
Liabilities, on the other hand, are things like deposits from customers, including savings accounts, checking accounts, certificates of deposits, borrowings from other banks, debt securities issued by the bank, and other liabilities would be, I guess, taxes and legal settlements. Sounds pretty boring, but generally speaking, assets are the resources that banks own and expect to provide future economic returns, and liabilities are the obligation that a bank owes to others and expect to settle in the future. So the thing to remember is that unlike with you and I, our deposit in the bank is an asset, while those deposits are liabilities to the bank because they owe them back to us.
Right. They owe us back with interest.
With interest.
All right. Okay. Here it is, as simply as I can put it. Banks rely on the balance sheets to calculate their assets and liabilities, which then gives us their net worth. But banks also need to meet regulatory requirements and maintain a certain level of capital. They call it capital. In this case, money is not capital. Money is an asset, okay, or a commodity. Capital is what money will buy. Now, in this particular case of the bank, money, you could call money capital because it earns you a return on your investment, just like buying a machine in a garage would do. However, this gives the false impression of safety for the public. With fractional reserve banking, banks don't need to have the same amount of money as on reserve as the loans that they make, which can lead to boom and bust cycles in the market. To put it more simply, banks make money when the money and credit they control is out on the street, earning them a return, but lose money when it's in their vaults, paying out interest. So it looks as though what we would consider an asset, as you said, in the bank, they consider a liability.
Yes. So when they loan out our money, they loan it out as an investment. It's an asset. That's simple enough. Okay, so where do we start?
Well, we're going to have to take another stroll through history. We can limit ourselves to modern times because these cycles really became more frequent over the last 300 years or so. For our purposes, we'll start with the creation of the Bank of England in 1694.
Really? 1694?
Yep. Yep. Now, the Bank of England is a private corporation. It's not owned by the Crown, all right? Just like our Federal Reserve System. It's a private corporation. It was created in that year out of the British government's need for cheap loans to finance expenses. Some 3 years later, the bank was given monopoly rights that covered banking and note issuing authority. Now, note issuing authority would be the printing of money, okay? When we get to the era of the Napoleonic Wars in the 1790s, the British government's military expenses got a bit out of hand. The government issued paper notes that the Bank of England was expected to convert into gold upon demand.
Okay, this is starting to sound familiar. I see where this is going. Printing paper money with a decreasing backing in gold bullion is the recipe for the depreciation of the pound and inflated prices of goods and services.
It was like they completely ignored what happened with Governor Hinckley in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1690. Remember the podcast we did on inflation?
Yes, I do. That was episode 10 for those who have listened or would like to listen. So what happened?
Well, by 1797, the bank's gold reserves had been depleted to dangerously low levels because of the heavy demands for gold redemptions from both domestic and foreign note holders. To save the bank from bankruptcy, too big to fail and all that stuff, the British government passed the Bank Restriction Act. Effectively, the bank was ordered not to redeem the note holders' paper with gold, the very same thing that Roosevelt and later Nixon did with the U.S. dollar.
I remember we discussed this in early 1933 under Roosevelt, that little dictator. He decreed in America that gold was outlawed under presidential order. Outlawed.
That's right.
And it was subject to confiscation.
And confiscation, not only that, confiscation, fine, and imprisonment.
Right, for owning gold.
Yeah.
Ownership was illegal, and they were able to raise the price from around $20 an ounce to, I think it was $35 an ounce, where it stayed for a little while. But in the meantime, they devalued the currency. Then all of a sudden, you could own it again. But, the funny thing is, the executive order was never rescinded. Dr. Tom, I'm beginning to see the parallels between the Bank of England and the Fed. They're both private. They both were formed to pull the government's chestnuts out of the fire. They both were given the authority to print money and to set interest rates. And they both were unhitched from the gold standard.
Exactly. The Fed is an exact copy of the Bank of England. If this isn't, repeating history, it sure is rhyming with history. But, by the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1814, 1815, the amount of currency and credit in circulation was far greater than the amount of gold backing it, leading to a sharp depreciation in the value of the British sterling.
Yep, and that was right in time for the fiasco of the Corn Laws. And I would refer our listeners back to episode 12, if they'd like to listen, where we discuss the Corn Laws.
Yes. Protectionist banking laws, protectionist laws for large landowners facing declining prices for their crops, inflated prices from the devalued sterling, a 25% loss of income for the government from widespread smuggling in black markets, and then the year without a summer. What a combination for one nation to confront. By the way, nothing here has any resemblance to free market enterprise, what Marx would cynically call the capitalist system. In fact, Adam Smith's invisible hand, the capitalist system, if you will, was being handcuffed by the Bank of England and by Parliament.
Dr. Tom, perhaps we can touch on Marx a little bit later. I know how much you love him.
No, please, I'd prefer not to touch him at all.
Well, what I'd like to do for the sake of brevity is to put the pieces together to find out how the Austrian theory of the business cycle came about. Now, you previously talked about 4 preconditions for failure. Let me see if I've got them right. They are 1, devaluation of the currency, 2, the fractional reserve banking, 3, widespread and easy credit, and then 4, artificially low interest rates. So the thing those 4 have in common, I think, is a change in the available money and credit supply, which does not conform to the realities of the market. Is that a fair recap?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It is. It's a perfect summation. But they also have one more thing in common: a bank orchestrating it. Okay. So, we have the stage set. Some smart people started to question the reasons for price increases. That's because we're talking about back in England. And among them was a man named David Ricardo. All right. He was an avid follower of Adam Smith. And in 1809, he wrote a series of open letters to the Morning Chronicle, which took the Bank of England to task for the inflation they were noticing. In 1810, he published a book called The High Price of Bullion, a proof of the depreciation of banknotes, which was based upon those letters. His book pointed a finger directly at the Bank of England. You see, the bank was freed from the necessity of cash payments because of the Bank Restriction Act. In other words, pressure from the wars with France pushed the government to bar the Bank of England from paying its notes in gold. The Bank of England and other rural banks took advantage of this act and increased their notes and the volume of their lending. Of course, the directors of the bank insisted that the subsequent increase in prices and the depreciation of the pound had no relation to the rise in bank credit.
Well, of course not. So, go on.
All right. So Ricardo and the others argued that the amount of banknotes in circulation had an effect on prices. This in turn could affect exchange rates and the inflow or outflow of gold. To address this, the House of Commons formed the Bullion Committee. As a result, the Parliament abolished the Bank Restriction Act, forcing convertibility to gold to be restored in 1821 to stabilize the currency. They had a lucky break, though, because this was the transition between their agrarian economy and their industrial economy with the Industrial Revolution. Their dynamic economy from exports and imports of industrial goods led to an increase in gold coming back into the country, and it eventually wound up that the gold that was coming in became more than the value of the pounds in circulation. And this helped to offset the damage to their internal markets because of the industrial expansion.
Well, but you left out one thing. What about the interest rates at that time? What were they doing?
Oh, they had no significance on what was going on. They were stable at the banks. The official interest rate across the board, the interest rate was about 5% for decades. Of course, there were loan sharks. You didn't have to go to a bank to get a loan, but the problems weren't from artificially low interest rates. They only rose to their highest at 8% in 1846, which preceded the Panic of 1847. This panic was the only one that Marx commented on, but let's go on. What we are beginning to understand is that banks communicate to the market in more than a few ways. It is interesting to note that in July of 1844, many years after Ricardo had passed away, England adopted the Bank Charter Act, which followed the advice of Ricardo's currency school and prohibited the issuance of bills not backed 100% in gold. It was a true gold standard. Unfortunately, this provision was not established in relation to deposits and loans, the volume of which increased fivefold in only 2 years. Widespread speculation into industry, especially the railroad industry, led to a severe crisis which exploded in 1846. And bankers took this opportunity to criticize the return to the gold standard. After all, the banks couldn't manipulate the currency because it could not be counterfeited. That was too honest for them. So the Bank Charter Act was repealed. Many decades later, Ludwig von Mises and Mary Rothbard both professed that it was not the central doctrines of the currency school that were at fault, but only the error regarding the differences between notes and deposits. Nevertheless, the fact that the banking system failed so soon after the currency reform made it appear as though the gold standard itself was at fault, and that restricting the central bank's ability to manipulate currency by enforcing the gold standard could only lead to economic disaster. In other words, they lied completely about what they were looking at.
So they blamed the left foot for what the right foot was doing.
Exactly.
All right, Dr. Tom, for the sake of brevity, because I think we're running a little short on time, let's talk about von Mises and Rothbard and briefly state their contributions to the understanding of business cycle, and then we can sum it all up.
Well, I don't want to understate each of these men's importance, but Ludwig von Mises was a leading figure in the Austrian School of Economics. He argued that the business cycle is caused by central bank manipulation of the money supply. Murray Rothbard was an American economist who was heavily influenced by the Austrian school. He built on von Mises' ideas and developed a comprehensive theory of the business cycle. Actually, it was he who named it the Austrian theory of the business cycle. Rothbard argued that the business cycle is caused by the expansion of credit by the banking system, leading to a misallocation of resources and eventual economic collapse. He really didn't take into account interest rates because they didn't vary in his thesis on the Panic of 1819, which was the definitive work on that panic. I'm really hoping that this will suffice, but I know I'm doing both of these guys a disservice. Von Mises was an exceptional analyst of monetary economics, and so was Rothbard. And there's much more to say about their ideas and their contributions.
All right. So if we want to manipulate the economy, we've got a few tools. We can inflate the money supply, which would devalue it, or we could increase credit with the same effect. The exact same effect can happen by lowering the interest rates artificially, right?
Yes, exactly.
All right. I think our audience will just have to forgive us, but we're restrained by time. Okay, so we have four major contributors: Ricardo von Mises, von Hayek, and Rothbard. From the four of them examining the subject, we get to the fact that each boom in the economy is spurred by increases in the money and credit supply. So massive debts from investments and spending from easy access to an expanding money and credit availability follows. So we've identified 5 things that will contribute to this expanded currency supply: the devaluation of the currency itself, the fractional reserve banking system, easy access to loans and lax requirements by the banks, and artificially low interest rates, making those bank loans attractive, increasing the prices of goods and services. With all of that, an unsustainable bubble will form, and the collapse or contraction will follow this.
You've got it.
Okay. Now, can you briefly and simply describe the effects of artificially low interest rates, devaluation of the currency, widespread easy access to loans, and fractional reserve banking will have on the boom part of the boom and bust cycle?
Sure. Firstly, when interest rates are artificially low, right, borrowing becomes cheaper and more attractive to individuals and businesses, leading to increased spending and investment. Okay. This increased spending and investment creates an artificial demand for goods and services, leading to an increase in economic activity and a period of economic growth, or a boom. However, this boom is unsustainable, right? Because it is based upon false signals created by the artificial manipulation of interest rates. And we'll get into what that means to industry, how they're interpreting that. The misallocation of resources that results from this boom will eventually lead to an economic bust as the bubble bursts and the economy contracts. Okay? Secondly, the devaluation of the currency can lead to an increase in exports and a temporary boost to the economy, but it also erodes the value of the currency internally, leading to inflation internally. Okay, so you're basically compromising your own resources to sell them overseas somewhere, and you're getting a boom in your return. All right. Thirdly, the widespread easy access to loans and fractional reserve banking can also contribute to the boom and bust cycle by increasing the money supply and making credit more readily available, leading to increased spending and investment. However, this increased spending is based on borrowed money and is not sustainable, leading to an eventual economic contraction.
All right, I think I get it. Well, we started out talking about communication. So tell us, what do each of these signal to the market which causes the boom?
Well, artificially low interest rates, the devaluation of the currency, widespread easy access to loans, and fractional reserve banking can all signal false information to the market. Artificially low interest rates signal to individuals and businesses that borrowing and spending are cheaper, leading to increased borrowing and spending, and an artificial demand for goods and services and for the money itself. Okay. This increased demand creates an economic boom. Right. Similarly, the devaluation of the currency signals to businesses that exports are more profitable, leading to increased production and an increase in economic activity. All right? Widespread easy access to loans and fractional reserve banking can also contribute to the boom by signaling that credit is readily available, leading to increased borrowing and spending. All right?
Well, so if I remember from your book, your father described this as giving a false impression of what money will be available in the future to buy products and services. Don't these all send a false signal that people are saving money in the present?
Yes, yes. This is all based upon the perceived ethical banking practices, okay? The market assumes that banks will drop their interest rates because there is a glut of money deposited that is losing interest for them, okay? So they have a glut of money in their vaults. That's what is interpreted. And that tells industry that there will be money in the future to purchase future products. So they reallocate their present resources, halt production on present resources that would go into the production of things people would buy today, and they get into research and development for products that they will sell in the future, taking out these loans, hoping that the future profits will enable them to repay these loans, okay? It is the same consideration for easy access to credit. If the bank is saying, hey, come one, come all, we got credit for you, just, come over and take it, no matter what the interest rates are, industry is reading this as people saving money to the point where the bank has a glut on it, and they got to get that liability out of their vault to turn it into an asset. The message here is the same, that there will be an abundance of money available in the future to purchase new products and services, leading to increased borrowing and spending. The increased demand can create the illusion of an economic boom, but it is not based on real economic growth and is not sustainable. However, when the boom eventually comes to an end and the resources that we have misallocated become clear, the economy experiences a bust as businesses are forced to adjust to the reality of the lack of real savings and the decreased demand. There's just no money there to purchase their products.
All right. Can you tell us about the fractional reserve banking thing? It might not be clear how this can have an effect.
Well, remember, we're talking about a false impression of the actual money supply. Rothbard concentrated more upon this than interest rates, as I said. It's called the multiplier effect. If the bank is only required by law to have 10% on hand for the loans it makes, it could take $100 of the depositor's money and lend it out to multiple people at the same time. If each loan is considered individually and not in the aggregate of all loans, that same $100 represents 9 $100 loans and the depositor's $100 deposit. That's $1,000. What do you think that does to the value of money? This is the same as debasing the actual currency by debasing its value in the form of credit. This is what Rothbard was trying to put across.
All right, let's begin to sum some of this up. What have we learned from all of this? We could say that central banks colluding, my favorite word, colluding with governments are the reason for boom and bust cycles. And those cycles will always result in one thing. You lose your wealth. And by the way, Janet, that's not transitory. The banks, however, always win.
Oh, yes, they always win. Always win.
The bank's loans will always be repaid, and their malfeasance will always be without consequence and will always be rewarded. As an example, I give you the bust of 2008.
Exactly.
This is where the government blamed big banks after having required them to make loans to anyone with a pulse. When the bubble collapsed, however, the banks were bailed out with your money. So now the banks who were, remember this, too big to fail, they're now too bigger to fail.
Precisely. Failure would have cleaned up the unethical practices of the banks, but that wasn't allowed. No. The beauty of the free market is that it is a profit and loss system, and that will clean itself up. Always keep this in mind. Understand when you're being lied to. The best thing that could have happened to the American people was to allow these banks to fail. They wouldn't have just turned into smoke. Other banks would have been born in their, in the ashes of their, using their assets that they had to sell off because of bankruptcy. That's just the way it is. And we would be in a better position. And it wouldn't have cost us anything. It always irritates me when I hear these people talk about businesses and banks that are too big to fail. What a bunch of crap is that? If the Roman Empire could collapse, if the Soviet Union could collapse, a bank could collapse, General Motors could collapse, and it won't change a thing.
All right. Well, there's heard a lot of passion in that, Dr. Tom.
Yeah, well, it pisses me off.
All right, Dr. Tom, I'm going to give you an opportunity. I'm going to give you a chance to play God, and I'm going to ask you what you, Your Highness, would do to make this all better. What would you have us do?
Okay, so you're giving me a soapbox to stand on. Well, I won't blaspheme by calling myself God. He's got enough to think about. So let's take a step back and analyze what we have learned from the wise minds that came before us. David Ricardo, Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard, and Friedrich von Hayek have shed light on the intricate workings of the monetary system and the business cycle. The first observation is that manipulation of the money supply and increases in easy credit by any means and artificially low interest rates all communicate false information to the marketplace. These are the lies. Okay? The second is that they can occur with or without the existence of a central bank. Ricardo showed that with a central bank, the devaluation of the currency by fiat printing of banknotes unbacked by gold increases the money supply and leads to inflation of the prices of goods and services. There was no central bank in the United States in 1819, but there was the multiplier effect from fractional reserve banking. This leads to a devaluation of the currency through the expansion of credit, regardless of the actual money supply and regardless of interest rates. Dr. Rothbard clearly demonstrated this in his thesis on the Panic of 1819. Though we didn't mention it, von Mises looked at the average period of production and based it upon supply and demand, but also looked at money itself as a commodity that follows the same law of supply and demand. Mises also looked into the concept of the theory of marginal utility as causal in industrial productivity playing a role in the average period of production. Okay, we won't get into these ideas right now. They're not really germane right now. Okay. Then along comes von Hayek, who was able to link all of these ideas into the idea of an information stream over time, showing us the effects of false information on business decision-making in the present based upon erroneous information about present-day savings and prediction of future available monies for future products. We know that all of these things, or a combination of them, led to the booms. We also know that they are all unsustainable in the long run, whether singularly or in combination. If you can envision a bell curve, you can visualize what the business cycle looks like over time. Now, if we were to address all of this with the intention of fixing it, our actual objective would be to eliminate the root causes. That is, get rid of the liars to get rid of the lies. This means we would have to get rid of the Federal Reserve System, return to sound money backing our currency and credit, eliminate fractional reserve banking, and allow the actual money supply in circulation to determine its own interest rates following its commodity value to the market. In other words, we must take what we have learned from the past, identify those same problems in the present, and change our course to make sure not to repeat those same mistakes. That's the whole purpose of studying the history of these things. Okay? Now, if you were to ask me how I would do this, let's think about what we would do and why. Firstly, We know that taxation and the Federal Reserve System was foisted upon the American people by deceit and misdirection to justify the elimination of panics or bank runs. This was a lie. It was formed to capture the money supply, profit by monetary elasticity at the behest of the government, eliminate their growing competition, and protect unethical and reckless lending practices on the part of their financial reserve banking buddies. Their end game is to transfer all private wealth over to themselves. They have positioned themselves to profit as much with the booms as with the busts. It's just like going long or going short in the stock market. The debts to them are always paid, both in the booms and the busts. When their loans, all based on credit, are called, the real assets held as guarantees are liquidated and the proceeds go into their coffers. Looking at the Fed as a source of lies, it covers at least three of them: the devaluation of the dollar through fiat currency and credit, control of the interest rates, and the protection of the fractional reserve banking system, leading to a free-for-all with the multiplier effect. If we get rid of them, we get rid of a huge chunk of the problem. It might even be a good idea to pass our own Bank Charter Act and force the Fed to redeem their IOUs with gold upon demand at the 1920 gold to dollar exchange rate. We would be kind, We won't ask them for interest.
I'd like that constitutional amendment on my desk tomorrow morning. I'll be submitting it to John Fetterman for ratification in the Senate.
Okay, well, I'll try my best. As far as the prevention of bank runs, okay, we have the FDIC. They've been doing the Fed's proposed job since their incorporation as a government agency in 1933, and they've been very successful at it. Then there's the National Credit Union Administration. We can hand over ethical lending practices to them since they stand to lose money with reckless banking. It's in the FDIC's interests to prevent bad banking activities rather than promote them, as with the Fed. Banks would play along because losing the insurance protection of deposits would drive their customers elsewhere. It would be an incentive for their customers to stay with their banks. They can hammer out a workable solution to the fractional reserve banking problem. That would be a problem that they would have to deal with. From here, we'd have to take a good look at government spending and force them to lay off the deficit spending of money it can't raise through constitutionally approved means. We did it with war bonds, rents, leases, tariffs, and the sale of government properties in the past. They can start doing that again. Banks will still operate effectively by lending out their own assets or their stockholders' investments. There would be competition between publicly held banks, just like with any other corporation. Perhaps they could even entice their depositors to become owners or stockholders and collect premiums rather than interest rates on accounts. Finally, there's the problem with the return to the gold standard. Okay, this may seem impossible, but is it really? The Brits did it. So you could still look at the gold reserve by looking at how many dollars can purchase an ounce. All right, it works in reverse. This tells me that the reserve is there, only now it represents a mountain of paper notes. What would the effect be to reduce the amount of paper while keeping the number of gold reserves intact? Instead of having $90 in your pocket, you'd have $1 with the same purchasing power as 90. You knock a couple of zeros off the end of it. There you go. I've just solved all the world's problems.
We've run out of time on this one, but I want to thank you for another insightful interview. Now, for our next podcast, we'll be discussing America's education system, where it came from and why it's failing. All right. Thank you for solving the world's problems, Dr. Tom, and we will see you next time. You've been listening to the Liberty Brief, based on the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters by Dr. Thomas Giordano. If you want to help spread the word, please subscribe, like, and share using the links below. You can also check out Dr. Giordano's book on Amazon using the links as well.